I'm sitting, as I usually do when I'm thinking, in this garret, out at my view of Paris. And what I see is interesting. It's a building close up and then a distance. No noise, no people. So you're thinking, seeing things at a distance, quietly from yourself out to the city. The charm of this place for me, as the charm of my loft in New York, is the extraordinary views you have from the interior. The loft in New York is really my home, and there are my books and my desk. That's different. And now I'm here, and I have a distance from France. I mean, I like distance. You know, looking at art is distance, a distant view. That's been my life, a distant view. I want to begin by making 2 points. I believe in the materiality of images. They're not postcards. And in fact, I turned from studying literature to studying art, from words on pages to pictures, precisely because of the material nature of pictures. What I'm going to be talking about, I suppose I would call, is the possibilities of painting. I've picked all these works myself, and they make a certain sense together. That's because I'm the one who picked them. But it's also because there is a tradition of painting, because I'm working within a tradition of Western painting until we get at the end to photographs. Let me begin with a painting by Bradley Walker Tomlin. This is a painting that I knew, not this particular painting, but there was a painting of his that I knew in the collection of an artist who was a friend of my parents. It was painted in 1953, the year of his death. And it's a marvelously disturbing, complicated painting. Right? The ground of it is not quite what we're seeing here. It's kind of greenish, not tannish. This picture is constructed in very thin layers. We begin with the ground, then we have on it sort of dancing large spots of paint, and then we have on top of that these squares, which are white and sort of bluish. But what's interesting when you go right up to the painting is that you can see that after doing all that, and you can see it's after, the painter took a pencil with a lead end, and he dug in, he ripped into the painting, he cut through. And you can see when he cuts through, you can actually see underneath the ground to the support of the painting. So it's a curious thing. It's like adding something drawn, but it's not drawn, torn into the painting. I was a well-brought-up sort of intelligentsia, to use a European or Russian term, person growing up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in a Harvard town with a great museum. We just went to the museums. It was simply what you did. My father was hugely intelligent in buying art, and it wasn't only he bought sculpture, he bought a Russian icon, an Ethiopian painting. So I grew up in a household with art, but it was just normal. I now want to turn back to the Renaissance. When I studied art history, that was the basic thing I was taught and I studied. In fact, it was the basic subject of art history when I first studied art history, let's say in the late 1950s and the 1960s. That is because it was basic to the study of art history in the German lands in the 19th century, which is where the study of art history, the modern study, the academic, the university study of history began. And it was there that art history was at once aesthetic, philosophical, historical, and psychological, a great intellectual discipline. So that is why I'm turning, as my second work, to a work painted by Giovanni Bellini in the first decade of the 16th century. He was a very old man. We're looking at three saints who represent the three ages of man. Saint Jerome in the middle, old, old, old. Saint Louis of Toulouse on the right, who is younger, and then Christopher and the little Christ child. They are grave figures who are firmly on the ground. You can look at the way the feet are on the ground. Or you can look at the way St. Jerome's hand rests on his book, absolutely firm. They don't move, they're passive. It's their presence, not their action, that makes them important and makes them commanding. There is very little space in this altarpiece. Everything is compressed. In other words, the foreground and the distance are actually both clearly on the surface of the painting. If you look at Jerome, he's in a landscape with a tree on which his book is resting, but he's pushed forward to be really underneath the arch of an extension of the church under which the other two saints are standing. Because those cornices don't go in, they look like they're going down. Do you see what I mean? They're on the surface of the painting. So rather going into space, he has made this whole painting a surface performance. I have a taste for artists who like the pictorial surface and work on it. That's a particular kind of painting, and it's a painting which moves me. I don't want distant space. I want artists accepting the fact that, after all, materially, they are working on a surface. The picture was painted for the altarpiece, which was in the name of a member of the de Laeti family. So in other words, it's commemorating, it's a grave piece, essentially. The other thing they did with Bellini, and there's a wonderful phrase about that, they told him what to do, but they also let him do vagare, that vagare su voglia, to do what he wanted to do. They said, you must do my funerary monument, but you can do it as you want to do it. So the two things go together. I mention that because I think it makes a difference for a culture to give artists good things to do. And we could ask ourselves, what does our culture do in that? Does our culture suggest useful things for artists to do or not? This culture definitely did, and that's an important thing about it. When I studied art history, it was a Germanic discipline. These German immigrants, who mostly were my teachers, because it was soon after the war, a decade after the war, and America was full of these people who had fled the Nazis. Many of them were Europeans, and I thought I was one of them. I have a Russian father, I spent a lot of time in Europe, I still spend a lot of time in Europe. So art history was an import brought over that meant a lot to me, and it was a marvelous field to go into. All right, we turn to a Cézanne painting of Montagne Sainte-Victoire, and now we're coming into the 1890s. This painting is about 2/3 of a meter wide, I would say. This particular painting is in Baltimore, and I've been down there to see it. I spend my summers right near here, near Aix-en-Provence in the south of France. And so this is kind of my landscape, and one of the reasons I love it is that it was his landscape. It's occurred to me when I go there, we always talk about, to interrupt myself, we always talk about, and Cézanne talked about himself going out onto the motif. In actual fact, when you are in this site, and you can go there today, and in the quarry, and you can stand exactly where this painting was painted, and there's even a mock-up of the painting, a reproduction there, so you can actually see the place. But you do not see Montagne Saint-Victoire this way from there at all. That's just something he sort of invented. It's over there somewhere, but it is not just here as he's showing it to you in the painting, not at all. Now let's look at how he's painted it. What's curious is that there is no foreground. The trees at the bottom of the picture just sort of come up into the picture from nowhere. There's no ground at the bottom here. The mountain, as we see it here, almost seems to be floating on top of the quarry. It's not back there, it's just floating right up on top. So he's another one of those great Western European painters who accept the surface on their work, which they're working on, as what they have to work with. They're not trying to break into it, to open up space. They just accept that as the surface. Now, if you walk up close to the painting, you will see the way in which he's not only painting, he's also drawing. If we look at the edge of the mountain on the right there, you see a kind of blue, at least in this reproduction, a blue line, which marks the edge of the mountains. Now, why am I mentioning the lines? It's an interesting point because in Western painting, or rather in the commentary on Western painting, there is a distinction made between drawing and color, between disegno and colori, between when you paint and when you draw. Now, what's interesting here is that Cézanne is doing both. He is both painting and drawing. And we might think back to Tomlin taking his pencil and aggressively drawing into that painting. Once again, in some way, combining drawing and painting. Now we can look at a painting by Velázquez, which is known as The Spinners, and which at a certain date was made larger than he painted it. And if you go to the Prado today, where it hangs, where most of the paintings by Velázquez hang, you will see it in its full size. But I want you to think about it as it was. So I'm going to cut it down to size as you watch me. We'll cut the painting. I better put glasses on so I know what I'm doing here. Let's get the painting down to what it was, okay? All right? Are we all right? Let me just be sure I'm doing it right, everybody. Here we have the picture, I hope, as Velázquez painted it. The more famous of his famous pictures is the Meninas, right? The maids. That's famous because it's a picture directed to viewers. And because of its puzzles, people have written a lot about it, and viewers have been very preoccupied with it, art historians among others. This is a painting, The Spinners, which I think is every bit as great, if not greater, and it's really about painting. It's painted for painters, not for viewers. Originally, it was called The Myth of Minerva and Arachne. The foreground is a group of women, simple women, who are busy producing the thread to make tapestries, which we see in the background, where we also see nobler people, including Minerva and Arachne. They, in the story as it's told by the poet Ovid, they had an argument about who was the better craftsperson. Well, goddesses don't like to be shown up, and in fact, Minerva got very angry, and she struck Arachne and killed her. There is a painting by Rubens, which was at the court in Spain, which shows them having a fight, really fighting. Velázquez wasn't like that. He turns it into almost a gracious greeting rather than a brutal attack, as Rubens painted it. Two very different painters. Now, there was a famous painting by Titian, now actually hanging in Boston, Massachusetts, of the Rape of Europa, which is what is represented in the back in the tapestry here. So Velázquez is taking Titian into his work. So we have this layering of artists. We have Minerva and Arachne deduced from Rubens. We have the Rape of Europa after Titian, and then Titian, like Velázquez in a certain way, copied it. So what Velázquez is doing here is kind of bringing himself into the history of art. The two parts of the picture are connected in a curious way by paint. You can see that the woman who's extending her arm out is winding thread. And that thread is a marvelous thread of white oil paint. And then if your eye moves up, you will see that the gown of the blue lady, who is in the back, but right at the edge of the back part of the picture, has that same kind of white paint marking its folds. So you really move along the canvas with white paint like that, when he simply boldly takes paint from the thread in front and just connects it to the paint in the back. Literally speaking, they're not in the same space, but the painting, of course, is flat. And here, of course, what's fascinating, it's a picture about the making of art, and everybody's a woman in the picture. Clearly, he, by the way in which he paints them, by the proximity to him, the painter, he almost identifies with the women. He feels, he wishes he could be one of them. What's fascinating, you see, is he doesn't think of painting as male. He connects it with women. Yes, get them off. We're turning to Rubens himself, the great Flemish painter, and we're looking at a painting of peasants, which he painted in the 1630s. He'd been to Madrid, he'd met the young Velázquez. Velázquez was very jealous and very impressed. And then he comes back and paints this picture. Now, this is not, and this picture is actually in the Louvre in Paris. It was called A Village Wedding, but in the Louvre today, I think the title is a Kermesse. Now, Rubens normally didn't paint this kind of thing. To paint this, he's going back into a northern tradition of paintings. Rubens was a painter who wanted to paint and could paint like Italians, big nudes and such. So this is going back to something of the North very, very much. If you look at the picture, this is very difficult to look at in this little baby postcard. It combines different kinds of figures. On the left are peasants who are, there's even somebody who's urinating, who's peeing in front. They're acting in a vulgar way. And then as you move to the right, there are kind of rather beautiful figures. Watteau, in 18th century, copied a pair of figures in red chalk, figures to the right side of all those peasants. And in fact, they're rather ideal figures. And he saw them as just beautiful, sort of perfect ideal peasants rather than all these ugly people on the left. Why is he combining all these low people and all these high things? What are they doing in the painting? Now, Rubens painted this at a very difficult time, circumstantially for him. Flanders was ruled by the Spanish. Flanders, sort of current-day Belgium, was in a struggle with Holland. Rubens served the Habsburg court. He'd been to Spain. He was a diplomat for the ruling people. And yet they were having the war, his country, with Holland. And it was just a terrible conflict. And he was absolutely torn between that. How is he going to deal with those things? In paint, he can bring together the ideal and the real, using sort of coarse, too simple terms, within a painting, which is something that he couldn't really do in the world. Now, that is something that art can do. Now, we live in a time where everybody speaks about global art. I might think it's impossible. I think art has to have a local part. And so the interesting thing for an artist is, how do you bring together what your roots are, the roots of your art, the roots of your life, and what is the greater world beyond? It's his only peasant picture, right? And that's why he's doing it. These are my roots, but after all, I'm a great international artist. How can we bring this all together? So that painting, in a sense, solves what in the world is perhaps impossible to solve. Okay. Gombrich was, to use the German term, my Dr. Vater. I mean, he was the man who really trained me. It was a hugely intelligent, hugely well-educated man who was questioning all the time. And so he was an example, so how you could be that way. One of the things he talked about was the role that the viewer plays in looking at a picture. We bring something to the picture. It's a marvelous idea, but actually my work really is more concerned with the maker than the viewer. My fiction is that I can explain how the painter made something. It's a fiction. Of course, I wasn't there, but that's the fiction of my work. Okay, we're still in the Louvre. We are walking several rooms further along, from the Flemish section with Rubens to the Dutch section with Rembrandt. And so, of course, we're going across that political divide, which Rubens was upset about when he painted this picture. We're turning to the right wall to see the newly cleaned, newly conserved Bathsheba of Rembrandt. It's about 1.5 by 1.5 meters, I think. Now, if the Kermesse, or wedding, Rubens was going native, in the Bathsheba, Rembrandt is going Italian. He's trying to compete in a picture like this with the great nudes that we know, Titian and such, from Renaissance. He never went to Italy. He refused to go to Italy. Many Dutch painters went to Italy, and Rembrandt knew Italian painting, mostly from prints, but he never took the trip. He stayed home, but yet he could compete very well in this great picture of Bathsheba. And it is a painting of Hendrika Stoffels, who was his common-law wife. Now, the year is 1654, and it's the year in which Hendrika was called up in front of the church because she was 5 months pregnant, and she was called up in front of the church for living in sin, unmarried, with Rembrandt. So the fact that he's painting Bathsheba and she is playing the role of Bathsheba is not irrelevant. There's a kind of overlap between life and art in that sense. Now, as you know, Bathsheba, it was a favorite subject for painters and painters of the nude. She's received a letter from David. She's at her toilette. There's her maid at her feet. So she holds the letter in a hand as she's thinking about it, as Rembrandt has painted her. Originally, in this painting, the figure of Hendrika Bathsheba was looking outwards. That's what X-rays show us. She was looking out at the painter. If you look at her body, you can see that her torso, down to her waist, is turned outwards, but she turns away. The effect of that is that she is, in a sense, refusing to be Bathsheba, and also refusing to present herself as a model for Rembrandt. So it's a painting which really shows a model's resistance. That's the extraordinary thing I would say about the painting. I mean, it's a great nude. And she's got this huge arm Rembrandt has given her. It's really a painting concerning what it is to look and to be looked at. What's interesting about the Bathsheba, it also is apparently a difficult picture for people to look at. Because when you go to the Louvre, even though there's this great picture, and they used to have a bench in front of it, so you could even sit down and look at it, people don't do that. Maybe it is because of the kind of, I don't want to use the word realism, but let's throw it out. Maybe it's because of the kind of immediacy of the way in which Rembrandt has painted her. What they do is they look at the wall to the right, which is an ox, a flayed ox. It's a painting of an animal for slaughter. It was another typical subject. And looking at a piece of beef, you know, blood and flesh, and it's not human. I mean, in other words, it's just a piece of painting. And this presents you with a human problem. What's she doing? How is she answering the address? Why isn't she looking out? Maybe if she looked out, it would be easier because you'd have contact with her. But she's cut off. She says no. Can I move these around? Yes, you don't care about it. Right now, we're going to sort of the heartland of Dutch painting. And this is a portrait of Sambavo, which is a church in Haarlem, painted in the 1630s, by a Dutch painter who really only painted portraits of churches. Right? And it's interesting that this painting is about the same size as the Cézanne Montagne Sainte-Victoire that we looked at earlier. When you see the Saint-Rédame, it seems big. It's in the National Gallery in London. Saint-Rédame delights in painting empty churches. Why the church is empty? Because they're Protestantized. The Protestants come in, they whitewash everything, they get rid of the altarpieces, and he's painting that, and that's what he delights in painting, a portrait of such a church, just as Cézanne painted a portrait of a mountain. At the time when he painted this, the churches were battlefields. The Catholics in Holland were allowed to practice their faith, but they had to go underground. So they had hidden churches, but they couldn't be in a big church like this. They had to go out. And Saint-Rédame sometimes even painted portraits of churches like this, in which he put an altarpiece which had been taken out back into the church, right? So what's so interesting is he's interested in the emptied out church, but he makes the church into, as it were, a place for art, for his art. Once again, the art solves the quarrel between the Protestants and the Catholics. The art is a way to paint something which is a painting. There is literally no frame. There's no reason why the painting stops where it stops. Saint-Rédame went to the church with paper and pencil and a measuring stick and drew a very, very careful measured drawing of the church. So the painting is done after a drawing, and the drawing is obviously flat. So that makes the painting almost double flat. It's not only the view, which is spread out like a map, but it's also the fact that it's done after something that was done before. He's kind of Mondrian in Nuce, right? This sensibility goes right on in Dutch painting. And if you look, for example, at the big pier or column in the middle, in front, and look at the bottom of it, you could almost see that it looks like a Mondrian. In other words, it's just grays, different grays at different angles. There's no depth. There is simply surface after surface after surface piled one on the other in this extraordinary, I mean, it's an extraordinary invention. Look how tiny the people are. I mean, what was extraordinary about Rembrandt is, like Italian painting, he made people huge. They were important. That mattered to him. While for a Dutch paper like Sanderdam, the people are just diminished. They're tiny little figures. They're doing what they do in a church, and since these were not churches, you took your dog in, you went to a concert, you wandered around, they drew pictures, blah, blah, blah. And he does all that, but it's not a church, though it is a portrait of a church. I didn't know really what I was going to study, but at Harvard at that time, everybody was studying Renaissance art, and I just didn't want to follow the crowd. So I picked Dutch art. You can't do a stylistic history of Dutch art as you can of Italian art. So I broke in, I made a rupture. I cut into the art rather than thinking of it as going along like that. Well, my work is just independent, and I'm a loner. Now, our third and last Dutch painting, the Art of Painting by Vermeer. It's important to me because it was actually looking at this painting in a poster, reproduced in a poster, on the wall of an office in a think tank, which is a research institute, which I was at in Stanford, California, Palo Alto, California, in 1970, 1975, 76, when I suddenly understood what I came to understand about Dutch painting. This painting shows us a painter with his back to us, we don't know who he is, but a sort of stand-in for Vermeer, at an easel, a model, and then carpet or tapestry pulled back, and a huge map which shows Holland on the wall with her cities around it. And then we have the woman, she's standing with a book and with a wreath on her head and with a trumpet. She's dressed up to look like Clio, the muse of history. I discovered that Vermeer had put his signature on the map. Right between the woman and the painter is Vermeer's signature. He signs it there. So he's saying, I painted the map. And then if you look up at the upper right-hand side of the map, there's the word descriptio. And the word descriptio was a word used about maps and map makers. They were describers. It's in Latin here, but they're describers of the world. So that really led me, it didn't come right away, it led me to think about Dutch art as something like Sanderdam, not like Rembrandt, but as Sanderdam and like Vermeer, as describing the world. By that, and I came then to write a book called The Art of Describing. Now, I don't mean it's describing the world, but it's doing it with paint. The Dutch had, in other words, a perceptual notion of art, and also a notion that through the eyes came knowledge. They were the first people to trust to microscopes. Leeuwenhoek, who was in Delft, where Vermeer lived and worked, suddenly thought, boy, with a microscope I can see something. I can see something that's real. Although, of course, they're trusting to a lens, just as painters are trusting to pictures. So the other thing the Dutch did is not only to think of the form of a map and the function of knowledge, but to think that through mediation you would know something. The mediation of a picture, or the mediation of a map, the mediation of a lens. If we move up and look closer at Vermeer's painting, we discover that he doesn't really distinguish between observation and painting. That's amazing. If you go up and look closely, you have to do it in Vienna, or you can see a good image of it. If you look at the canvas on which the painter in the painting is painting, you see that he has painted the wreath on the head of this model. And just beneath that, you see his hand, which doesn't really look like a hand. In other words, it is his hand, but it looks like it hasn't quite been recognized as a hand. And when you look at it in conjunction with the wreath and you look over at the model, you can see that actually it looks a bit like her face under her wreath. He's punning between how you see things. So he's playing with what he sees, what he observes, and what he paints. And I thought, for heaven's sakes, this isn't a picture about meanings, it's a picture about making. He's not making meanings, he's making a picture. So it's this sense of the artifice of images, that they're made things, a very high sense of that. We wouldn't say that looking at Bellini, we wouldn't say that looking at Rembrandt necessarily, but here he's going right into that area and investigating that about painting, right? And the painting itself sort of brings together the easel, the painter, the model, the map. I mean, this is a compendious painting which brings the whole world together in, I would say, a kind of additive way. Thing. That's just an accumulative surface on which he's brought together the world as he saw it. And I think I'm just going to end with Dutch painting there because that's a good way of defining, really, Dutch painting, at least as I see it. The rest I'll say at MoMA. Ça marche? You just cut it there. C'est l'entrée pas de public, mais de la staff. C'est dans la direction de Fifth Avenue. So we'll just meet there a little before 10.
So
yeah,
just be careful talking around it.
So we're turning to photographs because historically they come after painting, but also they come in my own experience and interest after paintings. And we're beginning with a photograph from 1873 by Léon Vidal. He was a French photographer, and he was commissioned to photograph all the objects in the Galerie d'Apollon in the Louvre, the new Louvre Museum. And what we have here is the photograph he made of a golden jewel box from the 17th century made for Anne of Austria, Anne d'Autriche. And what's interesting, first of all, this gold box, which you can see in the Louvre today, is 1.5 meters wide and high. It's a huge hunk of worked gold. And what the photographer decided to do was to do what a photograph could do, namely make it into a surface. So, of course, he's black and white, so he can't show you gold. He doesn't show you the bulk of the box. He simply decides to show you the top of it. It is really almost more than the eye can take in. In other words, you have to look a long time and look all over it to take it all in. That kind of detail is what a photograph, a fine photograph, is capable of. As you look at it, you realize that there's a kind of wildness to it. In other words, the flowers seem to be sort of bursting out as you look at them. It's partly, I think, the effect of the photograph and the fact that you have to really work to see it. So they seem to be almost escaping, but then the photograph keeps them in place as you look at it. This is something a painting could not do. And what interests me about photography, what I have a taste for, is what photography can do that other mediums cannot do. Ah, that's right. The surround isn't visible if we keep the cover on it, right?
Right.
Great, that's perfect. Then let's leave it like, that's what I want.
Okay.
I was shocked to see the surround, and now that we don't have it, that's fine. We'll have, I mean, with Joe's auto graveyard, we've got problems, because it's cut, and that's where I'll get the book out and show the other one with it. Okay, fine. So now we're turning from a French photographer to Walker Evans, a great American photographer. And what's interesting is, I mean, for me, what's interesting is I've always worked in European art, so it's a great pleasure for me to look at an American artist. It's also interesting that I think photography is a peculiarly great art in America. It was easier, I would say, to be a great American photographer than to be a great American painter, because there was you didn't need a tradition behind you. We're in 1929, Walker Evans is quite young, and he's photographing a crushed piece of tin. I'm continuing with metal. And what has happened is a piece of tin that was worked. We can see a capital, a Corinthian capital, and the acanthus leaves that go down beneath the capital. And the whole thing has been crushed and was discovered by Evans, and he photographed it. Photography tends, I think, if it's great photography, to make the world look strange. And to be honest, if somebody asked me, well, what's that, what's that, what's that, I would even have difficulty to name everything that we're seeing here. It is this crushed presence that we're asked to observe. And time is very much of the essence in photography, and Evans was really someone who put his finger on that. He said that it shows you what any present time will look like as the past. And what's superb about Evans is he said it's the present. He's not looking back. There's not a whiff of sentiment in the way in which he talks about photography. We're all ready? Okay. So our second photograph by Walker Evans, we're in the 30s, 1936, and he titled this, not on the page, but at the back of the book, Joe's Auto Graveyard, Pennsylvania, and this is in Pennsylvania, near Bethlehem, I suppose, in 1936. I was shocked, actually, to see this particular print when I came here to MoMA, because this is very different than the print that Evans chose both for the publication of his photograph and for the exhibition that preceded it. So now I'm going to remove the photograph that is in the collection of MoMA and put up a later edition of his, I'll just hold it with my hand. And if you can see that, you will notice that the little road in the foreground of the image we just looked at and is gone. So it's edited at the bottom to get the bottom of the image closer to the cars. There's no distance between the camera and the cars as we see it here. It's truncated. And what's interesting about Evans is he was aware that style was an issue in photography. And he said, he disagreed with the notion that he was a documentary photographer. He said, I work in a documentary style. So that's emphasizing the artifice. And he said that the documentary style had a purity, a certain severity, rigor, and simplicity, with its beauty incidental or accidental. Now that's a kind of tough view of what what his documentary style is. So I haven't picked favorite paintings, but I've picked favored artists. I know these paintings, I've seen these, I've been to see them, I like them, I care about them. But for me, essentially, in any anytime I look at or think about a painting, what always strikes me is how strange it is. But paintings are not things you jump into. They're things you are apart from. And that distance is also important for me. So strangeness and distance are sort of built in for me, are aspects of the art I've dealt with my whole life. We are always looking at the art, and then you just find what would help you do that. What words? Often contemporary words are important to get at the art. But I think the words have to be economical. They have to leave the pictures to be. You get all this work done, and then you look at the picture.
It's nice, even in the weather, isn't it? It's just quite beautiful. Yeah. It's kind of essential. New York noise. It's not Paris.